We will start chapter 13. Up to the midterm, we mainly looked at supply demand and various parts of that. After the midterm, we will look at different market structures. But first, we'll look at producers' cost first. And so we'll look at what is a production function. We'll look at marginal product. We'll look at various costs and how they relate to each other and output. And we'll look at long run versus short run and discuss economies of scale. To motivate this, suppose you run Foxconn Electronics Incorporation or Honghai Fushikang. What cost does this company have? What costs do you face? And what business decisions do you make that are affected by these costs? And what about if suppose you run Beinong, so you are Han Guoyu or Wu Yingning or whoever is the CEO of Beinong, how would your answers change? All right, so first thing, what are the costs of Foxconn? So please type in your answers. Okay, so I see a lot of answers coming in. Labor is something that's prominent here. And then there's also labor insurance and other labor costs. There's equipment, there's factories, there's machinery that you have to build and import. There's also raw material that's listed here. There's land, there's energy, there's power. You need power to run your factories. And also there's transportation that's listed here because you need to transport the raw material to the factories and you need to ship the final product out to the places that you want to sell. If you're Foxconn, if you're assembling iPhones like crazy for the upcoming shopping season, then of course, these are even more specific. You need assembly line workers. So it's not any labor in general, but these are assembly line workers who assemble these iPhones. You need to build these factories, these assembly lines. You need energy to function. Actually, for Foxconn, they even build cities, basically cities to host all these assembly line workers to churn out these millions of iPhones 24 hours a day. So you even need to build dormitories, restaurants for these workers, and recreation centers, and so on. Okay, so these are different costs that Foxconn would face. Oh, I love this. Liver, right? 爆肝, yeah. Okay, so list 3 different business decisions that are affected by these costs. So what business decision would Terry Guo make running Foxconn that is affected by these different costs? Yeah, whether or not to provide health care to the workers, or how many workers to hire, that also depends on this, yes. Where to locate your factory. Yeah, Foxconn used to be mainly based in Shenzhen or these other places, but they have built new factories in Zhengzhou, in Henan. Yeah, that's something that you should think about. Or if you're the CEO of Foxconn, you have to decide where to locate the new factory. And of course, that depends on a lot of these costs. If transportation cost is low, then maybe you should go to some even more remote area. If labor cost is high in Shenzhen, yeah, maybe that's why you're moving into Zhengzhou or these other places. So how much material you want to bring in, that's also something. Okay, so here we see various different answers. Hiring more workers, yeah, that's also always the big question. Okay, so suppose you run Beinong instead. So how would your answers to the first 2 questions change? Does Beinong face the exact same cost as Foxconn? Hire a Korean fish. Good point, yeah. Does Beinong have an assembly line? Does Beinong need to build, like, say, restaurants and dormitories for its workers? Yeah, Beinong is not a manufacturing company, so it doesn't really have a factory, right? So, I'm from Kaohsiung, I don't know. Okay, so the key thing here is that Beinong is an agricultural trading platform. Basically, it's the biggest trading platform for fruits and vegetables in Taiwan. And so they run these auctions. Actually, for Beinong, one of the biggest problems is that you need a large enough parking lot for all these trucks to come in and then to ship it out. And so there are debates about whether or not They recently built a new building for the auction house, but parking lot is not big enough, and so they have these different problems here. But if you are a trading platform, then it's not really manufacturing, so you don't need to bring in raw material. You don't need equipment or factories to build things. But what you do need is a very good location and a very convenient transportation so that truckloads of agricultural produce can be shipped in and be auctioned off and then sent out to the buyers. That's what this company is about. And of course, the cost that's facing this company will be very different from Foxconn, which is a manufacturing company. And of course, if you are the CEO of Beinong, you face very different business decisions. Of course, Beinong is a governmentally owned company, and so the CEO is appointed by the government. So there could be even a lot of political decisions to be made here. That's why we have all these Korean fish. Before that, it's Ning, who was the CEO of Beinong, and then people talk about the political debate and controversy around her. Okay, so now you know why we look at various different costs. Because a business, a company, would make different business decisions depending on different costs that it faces. So here we're going to look at total revenue, total costs to see how a firm maximizes profit. Here we are assuming that the firm's goal is to maximize profit, nothing else. This may or may not be true. If you think of Beinong, because it's a company owned by the government, it might have other goals. Even for a private company, the CEO may have other ideas. Instead of maximizing profit, he wants to maximize his own happiness. Or if he's crazy, he says, I want to maximize the number of pretty women in my company, or something like that. Then, of course, this assumption is wrong. But here, in the simple case of principles of economics, we assume that the firm's goal is to maximize profit. If you're interested in how things can go wrong when this assumption does not hold, you should look at more advanced courses in economics. In industrial organization, we will talk about how the structure of the firm could affect people's behavior and how that hinders the firm's goal to maximize profit. If you look at contract theory, you will see how companies would sign contracts with its employees and how that would help or hinder the goal that the firm wants to maximize profit. But anyway, so here we're in the simple case, we just look at, suppose we have the firm CEO is doing his job maximizing profit. And so how do you maximize profit? Well, profit is total revenue. That's how much you earn from selling your product, minus total cost. That's how much you pay for the inputs to produce this product. Total revenue is price times quantity. That depends on the market condition of the market you are in. So that will be for the next 4 chapters. This chapter, chapter 13, focuses on total cost. So it's the market value for the inputs that you buy or you employ for this production. And profit is total revenue minus total cost. So that's what the firm tries to maximize. Okay, so here we have a story. So Jelani owns gelato is an Italian ice cream. So if you don't know this word, this is ice cream. So you have this small ice cream shop on campus. She can make 15,000 pins of ice cream a year and sell them for 50 NT dollars each. Now, so if her total cost is 650,000 NT dollars per year, how much profit the shop brings in 1 year? Okay, so please join the quiz. So you can make 15,000 pins and sell at $50 each, and the total cost is 650,000 NT dollars. And so what's the profit for the year? Less than 100 NT dollars, equal above 100 NT, but less than 200 NT thousand dollars, equal above 200,000 NT dollars, but less than 300,000, or equal above 300,000, but less than 400,000, or none of the above. So a lot of you say equal or above 100,000, but less than 200,000, and that is the right answer. Let's take a look. So total revenue is price times quantity, $50 each times 15,000 pins of ice cream. So 750,000 NT dollars. That's Jelani's total revenue. And her total cost is 650,000 NT dollars. So profit is 750 minus 650. So it's 100,000 NT dollars. So this is a simple calculation. Now let's try to break this down. So first, one problem here is that what cost are we talking about? In one of the 10 principles of economics we saw in the first lecture is the cost of something is what you give up to get it. So here, this includes explicit costs and implicit costs. So what is explicit cost? So you have to pay out. So for example, if you pay wages to workers, that's explicit cost because you're paying this money out to somebody else. That's explicit. That's easy. The challenge is implicit cost. For example, you spend time running this ice cream shop. Your time has some opportunity cost, but you do not pay yourself for this time. So there is no money exchange hands, but this cost is still there. So this is what we call implicit costs. And so for this class, when we say total cost, it includes both explicit and implicit cost. So that's something you have to be careful about. All right, so let's go back to the story. So in this small ice cream shop, so Jelani pays $200,000 for raw material and $120,000 in rent each year. And she could have worked at a local coffee shop and earned 250,000 NT dollars. Not much, but at least it's something. And so the question is, what is her explicit cost and what is her implicit cost? Okay, so now please calculate. Here are the numbers. 200,000 for raw material, 120,000 for rent, and then she could have worked in a local coffee shop for $250,000. So what is her explicit cost? Less than 100,000, equal or above 100,000 but less than 200,000, equal or above 200,000 but less than 300,000, equal or above 300,000 but less than 400,000, or none of the above. So most of you say equal or above 300,000 but less than 400,000, and that is the correct answer. So trick question, what is her implicit cost? There is no money paid out here, but it's still her cost. Okay, so time's up. So the majority of you say equal or above 200,000 but less than 300,000, and that is the correct answer. Okay, so if you are still confused, let's take a look. So for explicit costs, that's what she paid out. So raw material, 200,000, rent, 120,000 NT dollars. So the sum is 320,000 NT dollars. The implicit cost is the opportunity cost of her time. She could have worked at a local coffee shop and earned 250,000 NT dollars for that year, but she decided to run her own ice cream shop. And so she's not paying herself that money, but this opportunity cost is still there. That's why it's called the implicit cost. And the total cost is the sum of these two, so it's 570,000 NT dollars. So we just finished the example on explicit and implicit costs. So now we're going to move on to financial costs. So here, the investment in factory and equipment is 800,000 NT dollars. So that was the investment to start the business last year. And so now, Jelani is incurring this interest for paying for this investment. She funded this 800,000 NT dollars with 300,000 from her own savings, and she borrowed 500,000 NT dollars. Now let's suppose the interest rate is 10% for both saving and borrowing. So what is her explicit and implicit for capital? All right, so please join the quiz. So Jelani invested $800,000 in factory and equipment to start her business last year, $300,000 from savings, and borrowed $500,000. So the interest rate is 10% for saving and borrowing. And so please identify and calculate Jelani's explicit capital costs. $10,000, $30,000, $50,000, $70,000, or none of the above. Let's see your answers. A lot of you say 50,000. Some of you say none of the above. Others say 30,000. And the answer is 50,000. The next one. So the same situation, but please identify and calculate Jelani's implicit capital costs. So the previous one is explicit capital costs, but now it's implicit. The majority of you say 30,000, some of you say none of the above, and the answer is 30,000. So the key thing here is that because she borrowed 500,000 NT dollars, so 10% interest is 50,000, so that's her explicit cost for capital. So yeah, because she's paying out the 50,000 NT dollars in interest to the bank that she borrowed the money from, so that's explicit cost. She funded this with 300,000 from her own savings. If she did not fund this investment, she would be able to save this in the bank and earn interest. And so she is giving up foregone interest, 30,000 NT dollars. And because of that, so we say that, so she incurs this implicit cost of 30,000 NT dollars. So here, she's not paying herself this interest, but by putting her savings into this investment, well, she is giving up this amount, and that's her implicit cost. So the opportunity cost for investing this 300,000 NT dollars into her business is giving up this interest. And so the total opportunity cost for capital is 80,000 NT dollars per year. That's the sum of both of this. So using implicit and explicit costs, we can talk about profit. And we distinguish between accounting profit and economic profit. Accounting profit is total revenue minus total explicit cost. Economic profit is total revenue minus total cost, which includes both explicit and implicit cost. So the key thing here is that accounting profit ignores implicit cost. So it's higher than economic profit. It could be that the economic profit is negative, but because accounting profit ignores the implicit cost, so it looks like this company is making money. And so let's go back to Jelani's small ice cream shop. She makes 15,000 pints of ice cream per year. She sells it for $50 each. Raw material costs $200,000 per year. Rent is $120,000. And she could have worked at a local coffee shop for $250,000 a year. And she invested in factory and equipment for this business last year, $300,000 from savings, and borrowed $500,000. So a total of $800,000 in investment. And so please calculate Jelani's accounting profit and economic profit. Now we're putting everything together. Now it's so many numbers. Okay, so here are all the numbers. Please calculate her accounting profit. Less than $100,000, equal or above 100,000, but less than 200,000, equal or above 200,000, but less than 300,000, equal or above 300,000, but less than 400,000, or none of the above. Okay, so let's look at your answers. So a lot of you say equal or above 300,000, but less than 400,000. And some of you say different answers, but the majority of you are correct. So, okay, now please calculate her economic profit. Okay, so the majority of you say equal or above $100,000, but less than $200,000, and that is indeed the right answer. Okay, so now let's try to do the calculation. The first thing, total revenue is the same thing. $50 each times 15,000 pins of ice cream, so 750,000 NT dollars. That's the total revenue. And then now we have to look at explicit costs. So that's amount she paid for raw material, rent, and interest. Raw material was 200,000. Rent was 120,000. Interest is 50,000. So the sum is 370,000 NT dollars. The implicit cost is what she could have earned in the alternative job plus foregone interest. So she could have earned $250,000 and she gave up 30,000 in interest. So that's $280,000. So accounting profit is just total revenue minus explicit costs. So 750,000 minus 370,000, that's 380,000 NT dollars. So she earns a lot. But if you look at economic profit, then you have to include explicit costs. So you basically subtract implicit costs, take into account implicit costs as well. So you minus the implicit cost of $280,000. So it's only $100,000. Actually, the $100,000 is the answer to our first question, if you remember, at the very, very beginning. Please calculate the profit, and that's economic profit. All right, so one thing here, if you look at this example, the key difference between the economic profit and accounting profit is first, the owner's own time, so the opportunity cost there. She could have worked and earned money there. The other is she gave up interest by putting the savings into the investment. Other examples of this are like, say, if you own the restaurant or the office yourself, then you don't have to pay rent, right? So your accounting profit would not take into account the rent that you should have paid because you own the house or you own the office or the restaurant. You don't pay yourself rent compared to if you're renting somebody else's house or office and so on. However, there is still an implicit cost here. If you do not run the restaurant on your own property, you could have rented this out to somebody else. And so that person will be paying rent to you. So you are foregoing this rent. You would see this actually around campus or outside campus because if you see, like, say, 118xiang, so LE 118, you have this like dozens of restaurants there. And it's very competitive. During lunchtime and dinner time, it's all crowded, but it's very competitive. And what you notice is that during, like, say, during winter break or summer vacation, some restaurants go out of business. And so if you're here long enough, you will see how these restaurants cycle. And the survivors are just super strong. I mean, they're super efficient. They sell these food that are unique and cheap enough that students love to go there, and people remember about that. Because you just don't remember, right? I don't know. I mean, when I was a college student, I always say that maybe after I retire, I should open up 3 restaurants in 118. The first one, 不知道. The second one named 都可以. And the last one named 随便. Yeah, because every time you say, what should we have lunch today? 不知道, 随便, 都可以. I should name my restaurants those names. Okay, but one thing you should note is that, so there are some restaurants in that street that have, every time you go past it, there are not that many customers, but they don't go out of business. Why is that? It's likely that it's the owner of the property who's running that business. And so he or she is ignoring the implicit cost, this opportunity cost of foregone rent. If he or she decided to close her own or his own restaurant, he or she could have rented this out to another person and collect rent. But if you ignore that and say, well, see, my accounting profit is positive, right? So yeah, maybe I should just keep running this restaurant. Although not that many customers come, but I still have somebody to talk to, I have something to do, I feel happy about that, yeah. So the owner could have worked someplace else to earn some other income. And by renting the property out to another restaurant, well, he or she could have earned more money. compared to running this restaurant himself or herself. Okay, so that's the leading example that you would be able to observe if you're around NTU long enough, that, hey, why do these restaurants that don't have customers seemingly are still there all the time, while other restaurants just come and go? Okay, so now here we have another example to see if you actually know the distinction between economic profit and accounting profit. So suppose the equilibrium rent on office space has just gone up by $5,000 per month. So determine the effect on your accounting profit and economic profit if either you rent your office space, so you have to pay $5,000 more every month, or you own your office space. Okay? So now please join the quiz. So now the equilibrium rent on office space has went up by $5,000 this month. So if you rent your office space, how does accounting profit and economic profit changes? Both profits fall by $5,000, or accounting profit does not change, but economic profit drops by $5,000, or economic profit does not change, but accounting profit drops by $5,000, or neither would fall, or I don't know. Okay, so let's look at your answers. So most of you say both accounting and economic profit fall by $5,000 per month, and that is the right answer. Scenario 2, so if you own your office space, so what happens to your accounting profit and economic profit when the equilibrium rent on office space just went up by $5,000? So both fall, or accounting profit does not change, economic profit falls, or economic profit does not change, but accounting profit falls, or neither fall. Okay, so let's look at your answers. The majority of you say accounting profit does not change, but economic profit goes down by $5,000 per month, and that is the right answer. So yeah, so the key thing here is that if you rent your office space, then you have to pay $5,000 more every month. The explicit cost is increased by $5,000. So accounting profit goes down by $5,000. Economic profit goes down also by $5,000. But if you own your office space, now your explicit cost does not change because you're not paying that money. It's the implicit cost that's affected. So accounting profit does not change. But because implicit cost goes up by $5,000, because foregone rent, you could have rented your office space to somebody else and earned $5,000 more. That's your implicit cost. That went up by $5,000, so that means your economic profit went down by $5,000. Okay, so now we finished talking about profit. Now we will look at specifically the relationship between production and cost. So here, we're going to first assume that we're talking about production in the short run. So factory size is fixed. Later, we'll look at the long run. So factory size is fixed. I cannot make a bigger factory and so on. It's like in your classroom experiment, equipment or capital is fixed. You have only one tape and one pencil. So too bad. That's the short run. So what you saw today in the experiment was the short run effect of increasing labor. But of course, I mean, you can think about, hey, maybe we should think about giving each group 2 pencils instead of 1, or 2 tape instead of 1, or giving you a stapler instead. A stapler is faster than tape, right? I can just staple everything. Okay, anyway, so that's the long run, when you can change factory size or change these other things. But here we'll only look at the short run first. And then, so to increase production, the only thing you can do is hire more people. That's exactly our example in our classroom experiment. Well, in round 1, only 1 person can produce. Round 2, you put 2 people. Round 3, 3 people. Round 4, 4 people. You have more people coming in to produce this item. So the production function is the relationship between quantity of input and quantity of output. So I put 1 person in, I get 5 rings on the chain. I put 2 people in, then I get 8 rings on the chain. And if I put 3 people, I can get like 11 rings on the chain, and so on. So this relationship between the amount of input versus amount of output, that's the production function. And here we have usually what you see is that it becomes flatter and flatter as production increases. Actually, in some of the groups today, it's actually negative. It actually dropped. You have this additional person that's actually damaging or tampering, messing up the factory. It's not good enough. Okay, so now let's look at another owner. Sever has a popcorn truck. So this is a fixed resource. This is short run. And he takes to the fair and sporting events to sell popcorn. He can hire as many workers as he wants, but he has only one truck. So that's why we talk about this is the short run. In the long run, he could have bought more trucks and run a larger business, but now the short run, it's only one truck, but he can hire more workers. So the quantity of output would vary depending on the amount of workers. If he hired only one worker, his truck would produce 30 buckets of popcorn per hour. So he can sell 30 buckets of popcorn. But if he hires 5 workers, then his truck will produce 100 buckets of popcorn per hour. So this relationship is what we call the production function. So let's take a look. So here's a popcorn production function. On the horizontal axis is number of worker, that's labor. The vertical axis is quantity of output. So with no worker, no popcorn. 1 worker, 30 buckets of popcorn. 2 workers, 55 buckets of popcorn. 3 workers, 75 buckets of popcorn. 4 workers, 90 buckets. 5 workers, 100 buckets. So if you draw this line, this is your production function. And here you see that it's become flatter and flatter and flatter. So that means that you have diminishing marginal returns. Okay, so here we have the idea of marginal product. So this is the increase in output for one additional unit of input. So keeping everything else constant. So like in our example, in your classroom experiment, adding this additional worker, how many more rings can your group produce? That's the marginal product of this additional unit of labor. And it's literally the slope of the production function. MPL, that's the marginal product of labor, is the change in quantity divided by the change in labor. So in our story, if the popcorn truck hires 1 more worker, his output would increase by this MPL. So here's our example. So going from 0 to 1, delta L, the labor increased by 1 unit. Quantity output increased by 30 buckets. So the MPL is 30 buckets. Going from 1 worker to 2 worker, you increase labor by 1 unit. The output increased from 30 to 55. So the increase in quantity is 25 buckets. So the MPL is 25 buckets. Going from 2 workers to 3 workers, you add another worker, but quantity only increases from 55 to 75. So that means that MPL is 20 only. And then from 3 workers to 4 workers, you increase from 75 to 90. So there's only an increase of 15 buckets. So MPL is 15. And going from 4 to 5, again, you are increasing another unit of labor, but output only increases by 10 buckets of popcorn. So MPL is only 10. So here you see that the MPL goes from 30 to 25, 20, 15 to only 10. And here usually we have what we call diminishing marginal product, so that the marginal product of an input goes down as the quantity of the input goes up. So graphically, that means that the production function becomes flatter and flatter, and the slope of the production function is going down. You guys already experienced this in your classroom experiment, where you add another person. It could increase at the beginning, but eventually the MPL drops quite substantially. Sometimes even goes to be negative. Rational people think at the margin. This is one of the 10 principles that we saw in the first lecture. And so the key thing here is to think about, should you hire another worker? Well, it would increase the output by MPL, but it would increase the cost by the wage you pay. So you have to figure out if it's worth it to hire another worker. So let's go back to the popcorn truck. You have to pay $2,000 per hour for the truck, regardless of how much popcorn you produce. And then the market wage for popcorn makers is 500 NT dollars per hour, ooh, that's pretty high, right? That's like your amount you would earn every hour if you were a private tutor. So there is this relationship between how much popcorn you produce and the cost. So let's take a look. So if I put in no worker, then I get no output. So I still have to pay $2,000 per hour for the truck, but I don't have to pay labor, and so my total cost is $2,000. But if I add in 1, 3, and so on workers, then I have to pay labor costs. Here it's $500 for each worker, and so my total cost would go up to $2,500, $3,000, $3,500, and so on. So here I look at the amount that I produce, the quantity, and the total cost. So here I can plot my total cost curve. So at 0, it's $2,000. At 30 buckets, then it's $2,500. At 55, it's $3,000. At 75, it's $3,500. At 90, it's $4,000. At 100, it's $4,500. So this is my total cost curve. So okay, let's look at this other example. This is not the popcorn truck anymore. This is another example. What is the marginal product of the second worker? And what is the marginal product of the fourth worker? And do you see diminishing marginal returns? Okay, so let's take a look at this quiz. So what is the marginal product for the second worker? So here is the list. So going from 0 to 5 workers, here's the list of corresponding output. So that's your production function. So what is the MPL for the second worker? So majority of you say 40, and the answer is indeed 40. The next one, what's the marginal product for the fourth worker? Okay, so the majority of you say 20, some say 10, and the answer is indeed 20. The last one, does this production function exhibit diminishing marginal returns? Okay, so let's look at your answers. Most of you say yes, some say no, and the answer is yes. So what is the MPL? So going from 0 to 1, output increase from 0 to 45, so MPL is 45. And going from 1 to 2 workers, output increase from 45 to 85, so MPL is 40. Going from 2 to 3, you're going from 85 to 115, so MPL is 30. And going from 3 to 4 workers, 115 to 135, MPL is 20. And going from 4 workers to 5 workers, output increases from 135 to 145, so MPL is 10. So the marginal product for the second worker is 40, because that's going from 45 to 85. The marginal product of the fourth worker is 20. It's going from 115 to 135. And so here you see the MPL goes from 45, 40, 30, 20, and 10. So it's actually dropping. So indeed, the production function exhibits diminishing marginal returns. Okay, so up to here we saw total cost. Here, I have to admit, this is one of the boringest chapters of the whole semester. You see so many different costs. And we just broke it down to what we call fixed costs and variable costs. So now we have 2 more costs. So total cost is the sum of everything, all these costs. Fixed cost is the cost that does not change depending on how much output you produce. So it's like rent or the price you pay for equipment. Well, even if you don't produce, you still have to pay rent. You still have to pay for the equipment. This incurs even if production is zero. This is fixed cost. And then variable cost is the cost that varies depending on the quantity of output that you produce. So think of a restaurant. Well, I mean, you have to pay rent, right? Regardless of, even if there's no customers, you have to pay rent. But if you want to serve more customers, you need to buy more rice, more vegetables, meat. These raw material, well, that increases. And of course, you need to wash more dishes. So you need to hire more workers to wash the dishes, to make the food, or to serve the food. And so these are what we call the cost for hiring more workers and buy more meat, more food. These are what we call variable costs, because the more customers you serve, the more you have to pay. So that's variable cost. Okay, so here's another example. This is Angel's knitted scarves business. So Angel loves to knit scarves. And so she bought 2 pairs of knitting needles to knit. So this is equipment to knit these scarves. And so it's $18. So that's the fixed cost of $18, regardless of how many scarves she makes. And then to produce more scarves, she needs more yarn and more workers. So you have the variable cost that depends on the quantity that she's producing. And total cost is the sum of the two. Okay, so, and you can plot this. So the fixed cost is $18, regardless of quantity of output. And then the variable cost depends on how many scarves you want to produce. The cost is different. And the total cost is the sum of the fixed cost curve and the variable cost curve. And what you see here is that the total cost curve and the variable cost curve are parallel because you're shifting up by the fixed cost, which is the same, regardless of the output you want to produce. Yeah, because the fixed cost is a flat line, is a straight line. Okay, so we saw total cost, fixed cost, variable cost. Now we're going to make it even more complicated. We put average and marginal. Okay, so average, we have average fixed cost. So fixed cost divided by quantity. That's the average fixed cost. So we have average variable cost. So variable cost divided by quantity, that's average variable cost. And of course, you can have average total cost, which is total cost divided by quantity, or the sum of average fixed cost plus average variable cost. So 3 more average costs. So the average total cost is the cost for a typical unit produced, and so it's total cost divided by quantity. So, okay, that's reasonable. But then we have marginal cost. This is the increase in total cost for 1 extra unit of production. So that's different from average total cost. This is going from producing 100 units to 101 unit. How much more you have to pay? That's marginal cost. Okay, so let's go back to Angel's scarves business. Here, average fixed costs. So you divide the $18 by the quantity. So if you produce 1, then it's $18. If it's 2 scarves, then it's only $9. 3, then it's $6, and so on. And the average variable cost is, again, you divide variable cost, $15 by quantity. But because variable cost changes, so 15 divided by 1 is $15. $25 divided by 2, so the average variable cost for producing 2 units is $12.5. $30 when you produce 3 units divided by 3, so the average variable cost is 10, and so on. And so here you have your average variable cost. And if you add up average fixed costs and average variable costs, you get average total cost. And so the average total cost goes from 33, 21.5, 16, 12.5, and all the way down. And then it comes up again. Then finally, you have marginal cost. What is marginal cost? It's the increase in total cost when you want to produce 1 more unit. So it's going from 0 to 1 unit. Total cost goes from $18 to $33. So the marginal cost is 15. Going from 1 to 2, total cost goes from $33 to $43. That means marginal cost is 10. Going from 2 to 3, total cost goes from 43 to 48. So marginal cost is $5. And from 3 to 4, total cost goes from $48 to $50. Marginal cost is only $2. And then going from 4 to 5, then you go from $50 to 54. Marginal cost is $4, and so on. So here you see that marginal cost is high. It goes down to only $2 and then goes up again when Angel wants to increase output quantity. So these are now we introduced 3 average costs and marginal costs. Actually, we should plot this. So here is the average fixed cost curve, because the first unit is $18, but because you're spreading this out to more and more units, average fixed cost goes down very quickly. Then you have the average variable cost curve and the average total cost curve, which is adding up average variable cost and average fixed cost. You can plot this, and what you see here is that initially average total cost drops quickly, but then eventually it goes up again. So here we have what we can call efficient scale. This is the quantity that minimizes average total cost. Here in this example, it's 6 scarves. So when quantity equals to 6, you have the lowest average total cost. So this is the efficient scale. All right, and now finally you can plot the marginal cost curve. So yeah, in here again, it goes down from 15 all the way to 2, but then it rebounds and goes up later on. So here there's one thing that's very interesting. So if you plot all of these together, yeah, it's a little bit complicated. But the key thing here is that the average total cost drops quickly at the very beginning because the average fixed cost drops quickly. But then, because average variable cost eventually increases, so does average total cost. And the marginal cost curve somehow slices between these curves. So there is a very interesting relationship here. The key thing is this. When marginal cost is smaller than average total cost, it's when average total cost goes down, when you increase quantity. But when marginal cost is higher than average total cost, among those quantities, average total cost goes up. Intuitively, this is very simple. Think of the average midterm score of the whole class. If you add somebody that's below the average, you pull down the average midterm score. But if you add somebody who scored 100 points in the midterm, and that's way above the average, then you would increase the average. So if the marginal cost, so if the quantity is small when the marginal cost is below the average total cost curve, adding this unit of production, then you will be lowering average total cost. But when the marginal cost curve is above the average total cost curve, producing this additional unit is going to pull up the average. And so the marginal cost curve actually intersects with the average total cost curve at the minimum, at the smallest average total cost. Okay, so now this is an elaborative exercise. So here is a table of variable cost, total cost, average fixed cost, average variable cost, average total cost, and marginal cost. And let's try to fill out the blanks. So how should we do this? The first thing, how much is the fixed cost? Well, even if quantity is 0, total cost is $50. That must be the fixed cost. So fixed cost is $50. And fixed cost plus variable cost equals to total cost. So that means I can fill in the total cost when I know variable cost and vice versa. So $10 variable cost plus 50 of fixed cost, that's $60 in total cost. And 150 plus 50 is 200. Okay, so then average fixed cost is fixed cost divided by quantity. So I divide 50 by 1, I get 50. I divide 50 by 2, I get 25. I divide by 5, it's $10. So that's this column of average fixed cost. Then what's next? Average variable cost. That's variable cost divided by quantity. So I divide $30 by 2, that's 15. I divide $100 by 4, that's 25. Then I can add these two up. Total cost going from 50 to 60, marginal cost is $10. 60 to 80, that's 20. 80 plus 30, that's 110. And then 110 to 150, that's 40. 150 to 200, that's 50. So here I get total cost and marginal cost. And average total cost is total cost divided by quantity. So $80 divided by 2 is $40. $200 divided by 5, that's $50. Then I fill in all of the blanks. Okay, up to here we looked at cost in the short run. Some inputs are fixed. You build a factory, you rented some land or an office. And so these costs for these inputs that are fixed costs. In the long run, then you can choose to build a different factory or sell your factory. You can choose to rent a larger office space or a smaller office space, or you can even buy more land and so on. So in the long run, so your average total costs at any quantity, well, you should try to use the most efficient mix of inputs. So you have to have the optimal factory size that gives you the lowest average total cost. So let's look at an example. Suppose, okay, let's go back to Foxconn. You can build either a small, medium, or big factory. And so for each of these, you would have a short-run average total cost curve for small, medium, and large. In the short run, you can only pick one factory size and decide how much to produce according to that short-run ATC curve. But in the long run, you can choose which curve you want because you can choose which factory size to build. So in the long run, if you want to produce below QA, you should build a small factory and produce at, this is your average total cost. And if you want to produce between QA and QB, you should build a medium-sized factory. And so here are your average total costs for the long run in between QA and QB. And if you want to produce a lot beyond QB, then you should build a big factory. So here is your ATC. So basically, you are at the lower bounds of all these various ATC curves, because in the long run, you get to choose. Of course, this is an example with only 3 factory sizes. In reality, you should be able to choose any factory size. So you have a whole bunch of different short-run ATC curves. And so in the long run, you should pick the right factory size to build. So the long-run ATC curve is the lower envelope of all of these short-run ATC curves. All right, so finally we'll look at economies of scale. So the long-run average total cost falls as the quantity output increases. That's economies of scale. So this is all about the long run. And so suppose you specialize, so workers specialize on what they do best, and so you can get economies of scale. This happens when quantity is small. And then there's constant return to scale when you can scale up. So long-run average total cost curve is the same as the quantity goes up. And finally, you have diseconomies of scale where now the long-run average total cost actually goes up when quantity goes up. And this happens when you have larger and larger companies. Think of Foxconn. I mean, in Zhengzhou, it has like 500,000 workers there. I mean, to coordinate that and to manage that workforce is just impossible. And so there you could have what we call diseconomies of scale. So yeah, so this happens especially when output is very high. At some sense, that's Foxconn's specialty. It has a way to overcome this problem. So economies of scale is when you're at the downward sloping part of the long-run average total cost curve. ATC goes down as quantity increases. Constant return to scale is the flat side when you have ATC is the same regardless of quantity. And the upward scale part of the ATC curve is diseconomy of scale. And of course, Foxconn's specialty is that it stays at the constant return to scale, even though it scales up to be like 500,000 workers in its factories. So we left off at the last part of the cost of production. We talked about economies of scale. So this graph illustrates the economies of scale, where the average total cost in the long run is dropping as the quantity goes up. And then we have what we call constant return to scale, where average total cost in the long run is the same as quantity increases. Actually, this is the part that Taiwanese factories are specialized in doing. They scale up like crazy, but still maintain the same cost. But eventually, you would hit what we call the diseconomy of scale. That's when the long-run average total cost has to go up as quantity increases. All right, so the last part of this lecture is discussion question. Think of your neighbor having a backyard garden, and he grows fresh fruits and vegetables, and they sell on the farmer's market. He says, I hired a college student who was on summer vacation to help me this summer, and my production more than doubled. Next summer, I think I'll hire 3 helpers, and my output should go more than 3 or 4-fold. So the question is, what can explain why the production more than doubled when your neighbor hired a worker? That's question 1. Question 2, will production increase 3 or 4-fold if your neighbor indeed hires 3 helpers next summer? And here's our Slido. Please type in your answers. The first question is, what can explain why the production more than doubled when your neighbor hired another worker? Oh, because he's a good helper. Good answer. More effective? Yeah, it is more effective. Calculation mistake? Yeah, that could also be. Okay, so here we have a lot of answers coming in. I appreciate your answers. So if you remember your own classroom experiment, you should realize that, yeah, having one person doing everything is a problem because you have to do all of the tasks on your own. But if you have a helper, you guys can divide the tasks and specialize on the ones that you are better doing. So instead of being a jack of all trades, each of you can concentrate on what you are good at doing. So here, yeah, you have teamwork and cooperation. So you actually have this different ways of why the second person would actually more than double the output. So I think it's not only that you have a very good, a capable college student as your helper, but also because of this, you can rearrange the tasks and focus on what you're good at. So the more interesting question is the next one, saying, will hiring 3 more helpers next summer make production increase 3 or 4-fold? Can this scale up? Yeah, that's the question. Okay, so we have an answer of uncertain. Yeah, so of course, we're not sure. So you might want to make an educated guess. Why would it actually happen this way, or why not? Okay, the helpers may not do as much. Depends if each specialize their job, and then maybe yes. Oh, not always enough equipment. That's also a problem, yeah. Okay, so we see a lot of different answers coming in. And the key thing is this gardening or farmer's market exactly at the constant return to scale portion of the long run average total cost curve? Going from 1 worker to 2 worker, it's likely that you're at the economies of scale. But going to 2 workers to 3, 4, 5, is that really at the constant return to scale region, or are we hitting the diseconomies of scale? That is, I think, is the key thing. You can imagine if your neighbor is planning to hire 3 more helpers, he could also rent just for the summer, like more equipment, more gardening facilities, and so on to help. So it's not only about capital, because this is planning about next year. That's in some sense in the long run. It's not tomorrow. But there is a problem that if your neighbor's backyard is very small, I mean, having like 3 helpers working in the garden may not be that useful because the garden is not big. Of course, if your neighbor is so rich that his backyard is huge, then of course having more workers likely would increase production by 3-fold or 4. Okay, but the essence here is to think about how production is done, given that we're hiring 3 more helpers, and how that differs from having only 1 or 2 workers. And of course, your own classroom experience likely have taught you a good lesson on what's the right things to do. Okay, so to summarize this chapter, in this chapter we assume that firms are trying to maximize profit, which is total revenue minus total cost. And so we're going to talk about cost in this entire chapter. There's explicit costs, wages paid out, interest that's paid to the bank, and so on. But there's also implicit costs, like the owner's time. So economic profit is taking into account both explicit and implicit costs. Accounting profit ignores implicit costs. So, okay, the firm's cost basically is reflecting the production process. So you have what we call diminishing marginal product, that your production function becomes flatter and flatter as quantity of input increases. So as your own classroom experiment showed, adding another unit of labor may or may not increase your output. Sometimes it could be even negative. And so your total cost curve becomes steeper and steeper as the quantity produced goes up. So those are two sides of the same coin. Then we see a whole bunch of costs. So total cost can be broken into fixed costs and variable costs. That's in the short run. Fixed costs you have to pay. So it's like the rent or other inputs that cannot change, like say factory equipment. Those costs are fixed. But the variable costs are things that would change according to the quantity of output. Taking the average of total costs, you get average total costs. But what we really care about is the marginal cost or the incremental gain in total costs because we're producing one more unit. And so you can graph this average total cost curve and marginal cost. What you find is that so the marginal cost curve will intersect with the average total cost curve at the lowest point of the average total cost curve. And the intuition is very simple because if you're adding another unit, it's like adding another person to this class. If this person has a score above the average, it's going to pull the average up. If this person has a score that's below the average, it's going to pull the average down. So if your average total cost curve is going to go down first, that means the marginal cost is below the average. But when your average total cost curve starts to go up, that means your marginal cost is actually above the average already. And so of course that means that you're intersecting at the lowest point. So all of that, when we talk about fixed costs, it's because we're talking about the short run. But then we can look at the long run where all of the costs could vary. There is no fixed cost. You can choose not to rent this office, or you want to build a bigger factory and so on. And so of course, in the long run, what you should do is you should adjust all of these accordingly. And then this is my one-page summary. You have opportunity costs, both explicit and implicit. So that gives you the distinction between accounting profit and economic profit. We have a whole bunch of costs here. Marginal cost, total cost, fixed cost, variable cost, average total cost, average fixed cost, average variable cost. Hopefully I didn't confuse you that much. And then in the long run, we have what we call economies of scale. So here's the homework from the textbook. And then here's the list of past homeworks. So you know how much I love this chapter. All right, so to recap, I do want to remind you the big picture. So this chapter is the foundation for the next 4 chapters. Because when we talk about profit, it's total cost and total revenue. So total revenue minus total cost is your profit. So this chapter is about cost. And then the next 4 chapters are going to talk about the firm's revenue. The key thing is that the firm's revenue depends on the market structure. So the next chapter we're going to talk about competitive markets. That's chapter 14. Then we'll go into monopoly, chapter 15. So these are 2 extreme market structures. And of course, the firm's revenue in these different market structures would differ. And then we'll look at monopolistic competition. This is something that's in the middle. So it's this extreme, it's not that extreme, it's something in the middle. And then finally, we'll talk about oligopoly. In principles, we only look at these 4 sort of classical market structures. If you're interested in more complicated ones, then of course you should take more advanced courses in economics. Why isn't the investment itself counted as cost? This is a topic that's beyond the scope of this semester because we're not really going to officially talk about investment. But the problem is this. Think of yourself after you graduate. If you decide to work in Taipei, and you decide to find a place to live. You can choose to either buy a house or an apartment, or you can choose to rent an apartment. Question, what's the difference? Well, if you rent your house, that means that you pay rent every month. You sign a contract. Typically, it's a year or something like that. But even if you stay for very long, it's not your house. It's the landlord's property. But if you buy the house or the apartment, that means that you own this apartment or this house. What that means is that, suppose you want to move to another country or you want to move to another city, then you can sell the house at whatever market price at that time. But suppose you decide to live in Taipei City for the rest of your life. What's the difference between paying rent until you die and buying a house and living in it until you die? If you buy the house, then you have heritage, right? Then you can give this to your offsprings or, yeah. Well, but maybe you don't have offsprings, right? Nowadays, some people don't even want to get married. Okay, but anyway, theoretically, you still could compare. So what's the difference between paying rent forever, of course discounted to today, versus buying something and then holding on to it and using it, or in this case, buying the house and living in the same house forever? What's the difference? Well, theoretically, there is some kind of equivalence here, except that some people buy houses not to live in. They want to make money out of that, right? I mean, they want to buy this house and hold on to it for a period of time, and then hoping that the housing price will go up, and then they will sell it and then make money, and then go to find the next house to try to buy low and sell high. So yeah, so here when we talk about cost, what we do is that, so you could buy a piece of land and build a factory, so you actually own the land, you own the factory. But you could also decide that instead of doing that, I would actually rent these facilities or these equipment. But when we talk about the production costs, what we put in is this rental cost. Because you don't need a factory from now forever to actually produce this product. Well, you only need it for a certain amount of time. If you think of it, at some sense, that's exactly what Apple is doing to Foxconn, right? I mean, so Apple does not need that big a production capacity. So it just contracts this to Foxconn and say, hey, from now to the end of the year, I need like 20 million iPhones. Make it for me. So in that sense, Apple is renting this production capacity of Foxconn. So it does not have to own the factories that these iPhones are assembled. So here, what we usually do is that we distinguish between investment, where you buy a property. And so what that means is that it's like paying rent forever, plus whatever you expect this housing price could go up and all that. It's a myth that the housing price only goes up because it could go down. Actually, one of the problems that triggered the financial crisis back in 2009 was the housing price went all the way up to a point that people who couldn't afford housing, they still decided to buy these houses, thinking that they can sell it several months later, and then which did not happen. And so they couldn't pay the loans, and so the whole thing collapsed. Anyway, so the key thing here is that for production, we only need to rent the capital, the equipment, the facility, the factory, or the office for a certain amount of time. We don't need to hold on to it forever. So that's why we will talk about trying to equate renting forever to buying it. But usually when we talk about investment, so if you own it forever, I mean, that's something that's different from the rental price that we talk about when we consider the cost of production. Please explain again the long-run average total cost curve. Okay, so we're going back to the early slides that somebody asked about this. So in the short run, your factory size is fixed. In the long run, you can choose, do you want to build a small, medium, or large factory? And the key thing here is that if you build a small factory, you have an average total cost curve that looks like this, which has the lowest point at a relatively low quantity. If you have a medium-sized factory, then you have a different average total cost curve, likely to have the minimum point at the larger quantity. And if you have a large factory, of course, you have a third average total cost curve, which the lowest point is actually at a relatively big quantity. So if you think of the long run, then the question is, how big a factory do you want to build? And that depends on what quantity you plan to produce. If you plan to produce relatively small quantity, what you should do is to just build a smaller factory. Build a small factory. In that case, you will be on the small factory average total cost curve. And so that has the lowest cost. Compared to that, if you're planning to produce a quantity that's intermediate between QA and QB in this graph, instead of building a small factory where you will be at this blue portion, this blue segment over here, that has a very high average total cost, you should just build a medium-sized factory so that you can use this segment of the average total cost curve of the medium-sized factory to produce at the lowest average total cost. And of course, if you plan to produce a lot, then what you should do is to build a big factory. Then instead of using this green segment over here that has a very high average total cost, you can use the purple large average total cost curve, and so that you can produce at a lower cost. In your classroom experiment, because we only gave you one pencil and one tape, so that's like the small factory. So when you want to add a lot of labor and produce a lot, then it's just very costly. And so that's why people suggest we should have 2 pencils or 3 pieces of tape and so on. And of course, if you think of it, in reality, sizes can go vary a lot. So you can have a whole bunch of different short-run average total cost curves. And of course, what you want to do is to find the lowest point of all of them. And so that's the lower envelope. That gives you the long-run average total cost curve. So no more questions. So that's the end of this chapter.